Sable had black hair, a trim black beard, and he had just decided to go corporate. He did drinks with his accountant. "How are we doing, Franny?" he asked her. 12 million copies sold so far. Can you believe that? They were doing drinks in a restaurant called Top of the Sixes, on the top of 666 Fifth Avenue in New York. This was something that amused Sable ever so slightly. From the restaurant windows, you could see the whole of New York at night. The rest of New York could see the huge red 666s that adorned all four sides of the building. Of course, it was just another street number. If you started counting it, you'd be bound to get to it eventually. But you had to smile. Sable and his accountant had just come from a small, expensive, and particularly exclusive restaurant in Greenwich Village, where the cuisine was entirely nouvelle. A string bean, a pea, and a sliver of chicken breast, aesthetically arranged on a square china plate. Sable had invented it the last time he'd been in Paris. His accountant had polished her meat and two veg off in under 50 seconds, and had spent the rest of the meal staring at the plate, the cutlery, and from time to time at her fellow diners, in a manner that suggested that she was wondering what they would taste like, which was, in fact, the case. It had amused Sable enormously. He toyed with his Perrier. 12 million, huh? That's pretty good. That's great. So we're going to corporate. It's time to blow the big one, am I right? California, I think. I want factories, restaurants, the whole schmear. We'll keep the publishing arm, but it's time to diversify, yeah? Franny nodded. Sounds good, Sable. We'll need... She was interrupted by a skeleton. A skeleton in a Dior dress, with tanned skin stretched almost to the snapping point over the delicate bones of the skull. The skeleton had long blonde hair and perfectly made-up lips. She looked like the person mothers around the world would point to, muttering, "That's what will happen if you don't eat your greens." She looked like a famine relief poster with style. She was New York's top fashion model, and she was holding a book. She said, "Excuse me, Mr. Sable. I hope you don't mind me intruding, but your book, it changed my life. I was wondering, would you mind signing it for me?" She stared imploringly at him with eyes deep sunk in gloriously eyeshadowed sockets. Sable nodded graciously, took the book from her. It was not surprising that she had recognized him, for his dark gray eyes stared out from the photo on the foil embossed cover. Foodless Dieting. Slim Yourself Beautiful, the book was called. The diet book of the century. "How do you spell your name?" he asked. "Cheryl. 2 R's, 1 Y, 1 L. "You reminded me of an old friend," he told her, as he wrote swiftly and carefully on the title page. "There you go. Glad you liked it. Always good to meet a fan." What he had written was this: Cheryl, a measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou not hurt the oil and the wine. Revelations, chapter 6, verse 6. Dr. Raven Sable. "It's from the Bible," he told her. She closed the book reverently and backed away from the table, thanking Sable. He didn't know how much this had meant to her. He had changed her life. Truly he had. He had never actually earned the medical degree he claimed, since there hadn't been any universities in those days. But Sable could see why she was starving to death. He gave her a couple of months at the outside. Handle your weight problem. Terminally. Franny was stabbing at her laptop computer hungrily, planning the next phase in Sable's transformation of the eating habits of the Western world. Sable had bought her the machine as a personal present. It was very, very expensive, very powerful, and ultra slim. He liked slim things. "There's a European outfit we can buy into for the initial toehold. Holdings Incorporated. That'll give us the Liechtenstein tax base. Now, if we channel the funds out through the Caymans into Luxembourg and from there to Switzerland, we could pay for the factories in..." But Sable was no longer listening. He was remembering the exclusive little restaurant. It had occurred to him that he had never seen so many rich people so hungry. Sable grinned, the honest, open grin that goes with job satisfaction, perfect and pure. He was just killing time until the main event, but he was killing it in such exquisite ways. Time and sometimes people. Sometimes he was called White, or Blanc, or Albus, or Chalky, or Weiss, or Snowy, or any one of 100 other names. His skin was pale, his hair a faded blonde, his eyes light gray. He was somewhere in his 20s at the casual glance, and a casual glance was all anyone ever gave him. He was almost entirely unmemorable. Unlike his two colleagues, he could never settle down in any one job for very long. He had had all manner of interesting jobs in lots of interesting places. He had worked at the Chernobyl power station, and at Winescale, and at 3 Mile Island, always in minor jobs that weren't very important. He had been a minor but valuable member of a number of scientific research establishments. He had helped design the petrol engine and plastics and the ring pull can. He could turn his hand to anything. No one really noticed him. He was unobtrusive, but his presence was cumulative. If you thought about it carefully, you could figure out that he'd have to have been doing something, had to have been somewhere. Maybe he even spoke to you. But he was easy to forget, was Mr. White. At this time, he was working as a deckhand on an oil tanker headed toward Tokyo. The captain was drunk in his cabin. The first mate was in the head. The second mate was in the galley. That was pretty much it for the crew. The ship was almost completely automated. There wasn't much a person could do. However, if a person just happened to press the emergency cargo release switch on the bridge, the automatic systems would take care of releasing huge quantities of black sludge into the sea, millions of tons of crude oil with devastating effect on the birds, fish, vegetation, animals, and humans of the region. Of course, there were dozens of fail-safe interlocks and foolproof safety backups, but what the hell, there always were. Afterward, there was a huge amount of argument as to exactly whose fault it was. In the end, it was left unresolved. The blame was apportioned equally. Neither the captain, the first mate, nor the second mate ever worked again. For some reason, no one gave much chance or thought to Seaman White, who was already halfway to Indonesia on a tramp steamer piled high with rusting metal barrels of a particularly toxic weed killer. And there was another. He was in the square at Kumbalaland, and he was in the restaurants, and he was in the fish, and in the air, and in the barrels of weed killer. He was on the roads, and in the houses, and in palaces, and in hovels. There was nowhere that he was a stranger, and there was no getting away from him. He was doing what he did best, and what he was doing was what he was. He was not waiting. He was working. Harriet Dowling returned home with her baby, which on the advice of Sister Faith Prolix, who was more persuasive than Sister Mary, and with the telephonic agreement of her husband, she had named Warlock. The cultural attaché returned home a week later and pronounced the baby the Spitz of his side of the family. He also had his secretary advertise in The Lady for a nanny. Crowley had seen Mary Poppins on television once, in one Christmas. Indeed, behind the scenes, Crowley had had a hand in most television, although it was on the invention of the game show that he truly prided himself. He toyed with the idea of a hurricane as an effective and incredibly stylish way of disposing of the queue of nannies that would certainly form, or possibly stack up in a holding pattern outside the cultural attaché's Regent's Park residence. He contented himself with a wildcat tube strike, and when the day came, only one nanny turned up. She wore a knit tweed suit and discreet pearl earrings. Something about her might have said nanny, but it said it in a certain undertone of the sort employed by British butlers in a certain type of American film. It also coughed discreetly and muttered that she could well be the sort of nanny who advertises unspecified but strangely explicit services in certain magazines. Her flat shoes crunched up the gravel drive, and a gray dog padded silently by her side, white flecks of saliva dripping from the jaw. Its eyes glinted scarlet, and it glanced side to side, hungrily. She reached the heavy wooden door, smiled to herself, a brief satisfied flicker, and rang the bell. It donged gloomily. The door was opened by a butler, as they say, of the old school, a night school just off the Tottenham Court Road run by an elderly actor who had played butlers and gentlemen's gentlemen in films and television and on stages since the 1920s. I am Nani Ashtoreth, she told him. And this, she continued, while the gray dog at her side eyed the butler carefully, working out perhaps where he would bury his bones, is Rover. She left the dog in the garden and passed her interview with flying colors, and Miss Dowling led the nanny to see her new charge. She smiled unpleasantly. What a delightful child, she said. He'll be wanting a tricycle soon. By one of those coincidences, another new member of the staff arrived that same afternoon. He was the gardener, and he turned out he was amazingly good at his job. No one quite worked out why this should be the case, since he never seemed to pick up a shovel, made no effort to rid the garden of the sudden flocks of birds that filled it and settled all over him at every opportunity. He just sat in the shade, whilst around him the resident garden bloomed and bloomed. Warlock used to come down to see him when he was old enough to toddle, and Nanny was doing whatever was she did on her afternoons off. This here is Brother Slug, the gardener would tell him, and this little critter is Sister Potato Weevil. Remember, Warlock, as you walk your way through the highways and byways of life's rich and fulsome path, to have love and reverence for all living things. Nanny says that living things is fit only to be ground under my heels, Mr. Francis, said little Warlock, stroking Brother Slug, then wiping his hands conscientiously on his Kermit the Frog overall. You don't listen to that woman, Francis would say. You listen to me. At night, Nanny Ashtoreth sang nursery rhymes to Warlock. Oh, the grand old Duke of York, he had 10,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill and crushed all the nations of the world and brought them under the rule of Satan, our master. This little piggy went to Hades. This little piggy stayed home. This little piggy ate raw and steaming human flesh. And this little piggy violated virgins. And this little piggy clambered over heaps of dead bodies to get to the top. Brother Francis, the gardener, says that I must selflessly practice virtue and love to all living things, said Warlock. You don't listen to that man, darling, the nanny would whisper as she tucked him into his little bed. You listen to me. And so it went. The arrangement worked perfectly. A no-score win. Nanny Ashtoreth bought the child a little tricycle, but could never persuade him to ride it inside the house, and he was scared of Rover. In the background, Crowley and Azrael met at the top of buses and in art galleries and at concerts and compared notes and smiled. When Warlock was 6, his nanny left, taking Rover with her. The gardener handed in his resignation on the same day. Neither of them left with quite the same spring in their step with which they'd arrived. Warlock now found himself being educated by 2 tutors. Mr. Harrison taught him about Attila the Hun, Vlad Dracul, and the darkness intrinsicate in the human spirit. He avoided mentioning that Attila was nice to his mother, or that Vlad Dracul was punctilious about saying his prayers every day. He tried to teach Warlock how to make rabble-rousing speeches to sway the hearts and minds of the multitudes. Mr. Cortese taught him about Florence Nightingale, except for the bits about the syphilis, Abraham Lincoln, and the appreciation of art. He tried to teach him about free will, self-denial, and doing unto others as you wish they would do unto you. Both read to the child extensively from the book of Revelation. Despite their best efforts, Warlock showed a regretful tendency to be good at maths, Neither of his tutors were entirely satisfied with his progress. When Warlock was 10, he liked baseball. He liked plastic toys that transformed into other plastic toys, indistinguishable from the first set of plastic toys, except to the trained eye. He liked his stamp collection. He liked banana-flavored bubble gum. He liked comics and cartoons, and his BMX bike. Crowley was troubled. They were in a cafeteria at the British Museum, another refuge for all the weary foot soldiers of the Cold War. At the table to their left, two ramrod-straight Americans in suits were surreptitiously handing a briefcase full of deniable dollars to a small, dark woman in sunglasses. At the table on their right, the deputy head of MI7 and the local KGB section officer argued over who got to keep the receipt for the tea and the buns. Crowley finally said what he had dared not to think for the last decade. "If you ask me," Crowley said to his counterpart, "he's too bloody normal." Azrael popped another deviled egg into his mouth and washed it down with coffee. He dabbed his lips with a paper napkin. "It's my good influence," he beamed. "Or rather, credit where credit's due, that of my little team." Crowley shook his head. "I'm taking that into account. Look, by now he should be trying to warp the world around him to his own desires, shaping it into his own image, that kind of stuff. Well, not actually trying. He'd just do it without even knowing. Have you seen any evidence of that happening?" "Well, no, but by now he should be a powerhouse of raw force, is he?" "Well, not as far as I've noticed, but he's too normal." Crowley drummed his fingers on the table. "I don't like it. There's something wrong. I can't put my finger on it." Azrael helped himself to Crowley's slice of angel cake. "Well, he's a growing boy. And of course there's been the heavenly influence in his life." Crowley sighed. "I just hope he'll know how to cope with the hellhound. That's all." Azrael cocked one eyebrow. "Hellhound?" "On his 11th birthday, I received a message from hell last night." The message had come during the Golden Girls, one of Crowley's favorite television programs. Rose had taken 10 minutes to deliver what could have been quite a brief communication, and by the time the non-infernal service was restored, Crowley had quite lost the thread of the plot. "They're sending him a hellhound to pad by his side and to guard him from all harm, the biggest one they've got." "Won't people remark on the sudden appearance of a huge black dog? His parents to start?" Crowley stood up, suddenly treading on the foot of a Bulgarian cultural attaché who was talking animatedly to the keeper of Her Majesty's antiques. "No one's really going to notice anything out of the ordinary. It's reality, Angel. And young Warlock can do what he wants, whether he knows it or not." "Well, when does it turn up then? This dog. Does it have a name?" "I told you. On his 11th birthday. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It'll sort of hone in on him. He's supposed to name it himself. It's very important that he names it himself. It'll give it its purpose. It'll be killer or terror or stalks by night, I expect." "Well, are you going to be there?" asked the angel nonchalantly. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," said Crowley. "I do hope there's nothing too wrong with the child. We'll see how he reacts to the dog anyway. That should tell us something. I hope he'll send it back or be frightened of it. If he does name it, we've lost. He'll have all his powers and Armageddon's just around the corner." "I think," said Azrael, sipping his wine, which had just ceased to be a slightly vinegary Beaujolais and had become a quite acceptable but rather surprised Chateau Lafite 1875. "I think I'll see you there." Thank you. My name's Andy Lindsay. I'm from Michigan in the good old United States, and I did my best to be Mr. Young. Have a wonderful evening.